Title: When the Safety Net Fails. The Story of Darren Fields by Elias Harper. Introduction. Workers' compensation in America was meant to be a grand bargain. Adopted broadly in the early 20th century, it promised a simple exchange. Workers relinquished the right to sue employers over on-the-job injuries in exchange for prompt, guaranteed benefits, medical care, partial wage replacement, and vocational help. In theory, this system would shield both parties from protracted legal battles and ensure a minimum level of security for injured workers. For a while, it worked somewhat as intended. But as decades passed, state by state, those protections began to erode. Business interests, insurance companies, and certain lawmakers quietly reshaped the system. Over time, benefits shrank, medical care grew harder to obtain, and standards splintered into a patchwork of arbitrary rules. What an injured worker received in one state might be a fraction of what someone with the same injury would get across state lines. This is the story of one man's struggle against that system. His name is Darren Fields. A former certified nursing assistant in Washington State, Darren spent 15 years caring for patients, often doing the kind of physical labor that kept hospital wards running smoothly. He believed in working hard, telling the truth, and relying on the institutions that claimed to have his back. Instead, he found himself entangled in a bureaucratic and political nightmare. As I, Elias Harper, recount Darren's journey, I will also name those he turned to for help: political figures, community leaders, union officials, faith leaders, and media personalities. Many claimed to stand for justice, labor rights, or moral values, yet turned a deaf ear to his pleas. Darren's story is not just a personal tragedy. It's a clarion call revealing systemic failures and hypocrisy at every turn. Chapter 1. A Legacy of Injury. In 1976, when Darren Fields was just 7 years old, he witnessed something that would haunt him for life. His father, Charles Fields, worked as a logger and truck driver, a tough, honest job requiring strength and skill. On a bright afternoon, a catastrophic on-the-job accident severed his father's arm. Darren stood there, terrified and confused, as grown men scrambled and shouted. Blood and sawdust mixed on the forest floor. The screaming tore through the air and lodged deep into Darren's memory. For the next 9 years, Darren's father fought a grueling battle. Not with his employer, they had long since washed their hands of him, but with the very system designed to protect injured workers. Charles Fields was forced through endless appeals, denials, and independent medical exams that rarely seemed independent. The workers' compensation system refused to acknowledge the full extent of his disability, stalling and minimizing benefits. In the end, he never received proper workers' comp, only eventually qualifying for Social Security disability insurance after nearly a decade of struggle. Darren learned early that something was deeply flawed. He'd been told workers' comp was a safety net, but he saw firsthand how it unraveled when truly tested. This childhood trauma shaped Darren's worldview. Still, he believed times had changed. He believed America had learned its lesson, that progress had marched on, and that if he ever faced such hardship, the system would be fairer to him than it was to his father. He would be proven painfully wrong. Chapter 2. The Rise of a Broken System. The modern American workers' compensation system evolved from European models in the early 1900s. Laws spread state by state, Wisconsin leading the way in 1911. For decades, the idea held, give up your right to sue in exchange for guaranteed, moderate benefits. But in the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st, employers, insurers, and certain politicians chipped away at those guarantees. ALEC crafted model legislation encouraging states to tighten eligibility, cut benefits, and outsource care to cost containment firms. By the 2010s, investigations by organizations like ProPublica and NPR highlighted these quiet demolitions of workers' comp. States vied for business-friendly climates by slashing benefits. One state might pay $35,000 for a lost arm, another $750,000. Federal oversight recommended in the 1970s never materialized into enforceable standards. Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Patty Murray, and even the U.S. Congressional Research Service noted the need for minimum federal standards, but no reform came. Lawmakers talked a big game about fairness and equality, but did nothing to stop this downward spiral. Darren was aware of these issues only vaguely. He knew that if he got hurt, there should be a system to help. After all, he was a caregiver himself. Chapter 3. Darren's World Before Injury. In Everett, Washington, Darren made his living as a certified nursing assistant, working at the University of Washington Medical Center and other hospitals. He prided himself on his spotless record, lifting and bathing patients, assisting with medical procedures, always showing compassion. He was a family man now, raising children and hoping his hard work would give them a stable life. He believed if he ever ended up like his father, losing a limb or suffering a disabling injury, he wouldn't be left to fend for himself for 9 years. He believed the system had improved. He had faith in people, too. He believed that if he needed help navigating any complexity, community leaders, elected officials, union representatives, even faith leaders would lend an ear. After all, he lived in a region proud of its progressive values. Washington state Democrats claimed to champion workers. Unions like the Washington State Labor Council promised to advocate for fairness, and faith leaders in local churches often preached about caring for the least among us. The stage was set. Darren's belief in a just system would soon come crashing down. Chapter 4. The accident. All it took was one slip. A patient transfer that went wrong. Darren moved instinctively to prevent a patient from falling and felt something tear in his back. The pain was immediate and searing. He finished his shift, hoping it would pass, but it didn't. Over the next weeks, he tried to work light duty, then no duty at all. He filed his workers' comp claim, thinking it would be straightforward. Instead, he encountered delays, suspicion, and denial. Doctors chosen by the insurer minimized his injury. Treatments were denied or delayed. Vocational retraining, the lifeline for many injured workers, never materialized. Darren realized he was at war with the system his father had fought decades earlier. Only now it wore a new face of bureaucratic complexity. He tried to remain calm, to trust in his elected representatives, his union allies, his community. He would soon learn their true colors. Chapter 5. Seeking help, finding silence. Darren wrote letters, made calls, and sent emails. He reached out to every name he'd learned to trust. Senator Karen Kaiser, chair of the Senate Labor and Commerce Committee, who claimed to fight for workers but never lifted a finger for Darren. Representative Emily Wicks, a communications professional turned lawmaker who branded herself as a champion for women and community issues. Yet when Darren asked for her help, she and her legislative aides ignored him, eventually taking out restraining orders to silence him. Representative June Robinson, who had the power to advocate for policy changes, remained silent when Darren pleaded. Mike Sells, a longtime state representative and labor advocate, dismissed Darren's calls for minimum federal standards. A union man who refused to press for the federal oversight Darren needed. Bob Hasegawa, a state senator once thought to be sympathetic to working-class struggles, told Darren to go talk to others like Senator Karen Kaiser, passing the buck. Rick Larson, U.S. representative, supposedly a moderate Democrat caring about local issues, but when Darren's pleas reached his office, nothing happened. Darren asked advocates like Claudia Leager from CMAR Behavioral Health, who had legislative contacts, to tell Larson about the harm being done. She refused to convey Darren's truth. He reached out to Senator Patty Murray and Senator Bernie Sanders, who in 2015 acknowledged injured workers needed federal standards. Yet when Darren begged them to reintroduce the topic, they fell silent. Sanders, who built a brand on equality, said nothing. Murray, Washington's senior senator, also said nothing. Tom Perez, former DNC chair, had once agreed about the need for oversight, but offered no help now. Darren turned to progressive activists. Kshama Sawant, Seattle City Council socialist, vocal on minimum wage and Medicare for all, would not speak out for federal workers' comp standards. Pramila Jayapal, U.S. representative known for championing Medicare for all, offered no hand. Jason Call, a Bernie-crat running for Congress, dismissed Darren as unhinged for demanding action on injured workers' rights. Tamborine Borelli, once a Bernie-crat, now a Trump sympathizer, told Darren they didn't need his issue on the table. Tyler Vega, our revolution activist, told Darren to vote for a Republican work comp lawyer, Scott Staff, rather than address federal standards. Darren contacted union leaders like Larry Brown of the Washington State Labor Council, hoping for solidarity. Brown praised pensions, but never pressed for federal changes to protect workers like Darren. Randy Weingarten, president of AFT, a national teachers union often claiming to stand with all workers, remained silent. Darren even tried faith leaders in the community, pastors from local churches and organizations that claimed to advocate for human rights and the poor. They listened politely or not at all. None stepped forward publicly to say, "This man's struggle is a moral failing of our system." The faith leaders who sermonized compassion seemed uninterested in this complex injustice. He reached out to media figures, independent journalists. Tom Hartman, a progressive radio host who wrote about inequality, ignored Darren's calls to discuss minimum federal standards for injured workers. The silence was deafening. Chapter 6. The burden of speaking truth alone. Darren resorted to faxing documentation, sending emails packed with evidence of systemic failure. He pointed out discrepancies, quoting sources like NPR and ProPublica, highlighting how cost-shifting pushed injured workers from state rolls onto SSDI. He demonstrated how doctors hired by insurers watered down diagnoses. He cited the Congressional Research Service's 2020 finding that a bilateral commission was needed again to stabilize and equalize workers' comp nationally. Instead of support, Darren got pushback. The bureaucracy hounded him for alleged overpayments. SSDI bill, an anonymous figure in the Social Security Administration's offset unit, hounded Darren, incorrectly demanding thousands of dollars. When Darren tried to appeal, Bill called the FBI, sending agents to Darren's home. The agents, thankfully, saw he was no threat, just a man desperate to be heard. This wasn't just legal harassment. It was emotional torture. Darren's mental health deteriorated. He sought help at CMAR Behavioral Health. While his therapist encouraged him to sing, to talk it out, to share his story online, the administrative side of CMAR did nothing to help advocate on his behalf. In fact, when Darren begged Claudia Leager, the legislative liaison at CMAR, to tell Representative Rick Larson about the crisis facing injured workers, she declined. When Darren grew frustrated and raised his voice, they labeled him unstable and eventually cut off his mental health services right before Christmas. It was cruelty layered upon cruelty. Silence weaponized. Chapter 7. A history replayed. It felt like a cruel echo of his father's fate. Darren remembered Charles Fields, how he lost his arm, how he fought 9 years just to get SSDI. No proper workers' comp settlement, no easy path. Darren thought he lived in more enlightened times, but the same rot festered. Darren's father had at least known it was a rigged system for workers in the 1970s and 80s. Darren hoped by the 2000s and 2010s, people like Bernie Sanders, Patty Murray, and local progressive leaders would stand up. They did not. He saw farm workers hurt in fields, immigrants injured on production lines, nurses with PTSD, all facing the same barriers. On Latino Legislative Day, Darren watched as state leaders like Lieutenant Governor Cyrus Habib, Representative Lillian Ortiz-Self, and the Latino Civic Alliance spun a narrative that Latinos should not fear reporting on-the-job injuries, ignoring 400 injured farm workers who said otherwise. Darren saw Karen Chase, Snohomish County Human Rights Director, and her mother, former Senator Marilyn Chase, remained silent despite their supposed human rights advocacy. Darren's father-in-law, an immigrant, was worked to death at Walmart after an on-the-job injury. Doctors, protected by state medical boards, granted immunity and downplayed injuries. No official, local, state, or federal uttered a word about imposing federal standards to stop these abuses. Chapter 8. The hard truth of minimum federal standards. Darren learned that the workers' compensation system's brokenness was not a secret. Federal oversight had been recommended in 1972 by a national commission under President Nixon, but no enduring federal standards were adopted. In 2015, Senator Sanders and Senator Murray wrote a letter acknowledging the need for minimum standards. The U.S. Congressional Research Service reiterated that need in 2020. Yet no one reintroduced a bill, no one demanded a new commission, no one made it a campaign issue. Without federal standards, workers were hostages to their state's political climate. If ALEC-inspired lawmakers, often Republicans but sometimes Democrats, decided to cut benefits, What recourse was there? If doctors aligned with insurers lied, if vocational help never came, if PTSD coverage varied by state, what could a worker do? Darren cried out for a new National Workers' Compensation Commission, or at least a serious federal intervention. He was met with the same refrain: silence or derision. Chapter 9. Attempts to shame and shun politicians like Emily Wicks used legal intimidation, restraining orders, to shut Darren up. He had begged her to watch videos explaining the problem, to read documents, to consider supporting federal standards. Instead, her office framed him as a harasser. The establishment, both political and non-political, preferred to treat him as a crank rather than address the truth in his message. Similarly, when Darren reached out to self-styled labor advocates like Mike Sells and Larry Brown, they responded with platitudes. They might say, "You have a lifetime pension," ignoring that SSID and partial compensations were not real pensions, but a humiliating compromise, a fraction of what he deserved. They didn't want to talk about how we could ensure no other worker faced this fate. Faith leaders who prided themselves on defending the vulnerable remained curiously absent. Pastors, priests, and spiritual advisors from various local churches, who would rally for food drives or housing the homeless, kept their heads down rather than confront a complex injustice. Moral leadership failed when it mattered most. Chapter 10. A broken media and activist landscape. Darren turned to progressive media. He tried contacting Tom Hartman, who wrote best-selling books on inequality. Hartman made money off discussing systemic injustice, but never dedicated a segment to the plight of injured workers needing federal standards. He ignored Darren's calls to highlight the issue. Whole Washington activists and Medicare for All campaigners like Pramila Jayapal and groups like Our Revolution prioritized their agendas: universal health care, $15 minimum wage, yet dismissed Darren's demands that basic human rights for injured workers join their platform. Kshama Sawant, known for fighting Amazon and pushing $15 an hour, stayed silent about workers' comp injustices. Randy Weingarten, who claimed to stand for educators and all working people, never uttered a word. To Darren, it felt like a grand hypocrisy. These progressives fought valiantly for causes that grabbed headlines, but they avoided the nuanced, less glamorous, but equally vital cause of minimum federal workers' comp standards. Chapter 11. Cost shifting and opiates. The cost shifting Darren endured, being shoved from Landy to SSDI, wasn't unique. Thousands faced similar fates. Injured workers were denied timely, appropriate care, then ended up relying on opioids to manage pain. A significant chunk of opioid-related suicides could be traced back to those suffering from untreated or undermined work injuries. Had anyone, politicians, faith leaders, union heads, raised this alarm? Had any of them said, "We must ensure uniform standards so no worker is driven to despair"? No. They focused on partisan battles, leaving injured workers like Darren as collateral damage. Chapter 12. Darren's reckoning. After years of fighting, Darren accepted a grim truth. The silence was deliberate. Leaders who claimed moral high ground, Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Patty Murray, Representative Rick Larson, Representative Emily Wicks, Senator Karen Kaiser, Representative June Robinson, Mike Sells, Bob Hasagawa, Kshama Sawant, Pramila Jayapal, Jason Call, union leaders, faith groups, and journalists like Tom Hartman were all complicit in their silence. His father's 9-year battle and eventual SSDI reliance, his own struggle of endless litigation, fruitless appeals, and character assassination, all proved that America refused to face workers' comp injustices. The grand bargain had become a grand betrayal. Chapter 13. Finding a voice in isolation. Stripped of support, Darren turned inward. He recorded videos, wrote blog posts, made music to ease his torment. Online, he found small groups of injured workers sharing horror stories. They were nurses, factory workers, farm workers, teachers. Some had lost limbs, others their sanity, all for lack of proper compensation and assistance. These marginalized voices encouraged Darren. Though no major leader stepped up, maybe collective grassroots action could force a reckoning. Maybe injured workers could form coalitions, reach out to honest journalists, and push for legislation that no politician could ignore. Chapter 14. Lessons for America. Darren's journey teaches that no cause is truly progressive if it ignores the plight of injured workers. True justice means addressing all inequalities, not just the ones that trend on social media. Federal standards are not a pipe dream. They are a moral imperative if we value human life and labor. His ordeal also shows that community and faith leaders who preach compassion must act on it. If they remain silent in the face of systemic harm, they fail their congregations and their communities. Chapter 15. Beyond despair. Despite everything, Darren refuses to abandon hope. He knows that publicizing his experiences, calling out each silent leader by name, shining a bright light on hypocrisy, can spark indignation. And indignation can fuel change. He imagines a future where a national workers' comp commission enforces minimum standards, where an arm lost in Alabama or Washington commands dignity and fair compensation, where a nurse who dedicates 15 years to patient care isn't tossed aside after injury, where Senator Bernie Sanders doesn't just acknowledge the need in a letter but champions it openly, where Senator Patty Murray uses her seniority to push a commission, where local lawmakers like Emily Wicks, Karen Kaiser, and Rick Larson can't dodge accountability, where faith leaders publicly denounce the injustice and unions demand action beyond lip service. If these changes come, it will be because people refuse to let Darren's truth die in silence. Epilogue. When the safety net fails, men like Darren Fields are left clinging to thin air. He began as a believer in the system, a man who took care of others. He ends up chastened but unbroken. He has named every silent ally turned betrayer, every leader who stayed quiet while workers suffered. His story is a challenge to politicians, unions, faith leaders, activists, and journalists. Dare to face the truth. Dare to break the silence. Dare to help craft a better future. Only then can we rebuild the grand bargain and honor the promise that no worker, no human being, should be left behind when they are hurt doing their job. Until that day, Darren Fields, like his father before him, stands as a living testimony of what happens when the powerful turn away. He demands we ask ourselves, are we better than this? Will we ever be? Only time and our collective courage will tell. The end.